The relationship between the United States and Russia is once again characterized by deep mistrust and open hostility. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought a brief moment of optimism. Many hoped for a new era of cooperation and partnership. However, that hope proved short-lived. NATO expansion eastward, the US-led interventions in Iraq and Libya, and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine have poisoned relations between the two nuclear superpowers. Today the world watches with bated breath. The threat of a direct military confrontation between the US and Russia looms larger than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. This essay will explore a hypothetical but all too plausible scenario, a full-scale war between the US and Russia. We will examine potential triggers for such a conflict, analyze possible military strategies, and consider the devastating global consequences. The ideological divide between communism and capitalism has faded, yet the struggle for power and influence continues unabated. Both the US and Russia view each other as rivals. They compete for dominance in key strategic regions. This competition plays out in various ways, including military buildups, proxy wars, and cyber attacks. The danger of miscalculation is acute. A seemingly minor incident could quickly escalate into a major conflict. One potential flashpoint for a US-Russia war is the Baltic region. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, all NATO members, border Russia. These nations harbor significant Russian-speaking populations. Moscow has expressed concerns about their treatment. Any perceived threat to these populations could serve as a pretext for Russian intervention. Imagine a scenario where unrest erupts in a predominantly Russian-speaking city in Latvia. Pro-Russian protesters clash with Latvian security forces. Russia, citing its responsibility to protect ethnic Russians, sends in troops. NATO, bound by Article 5, responds with military force. The conflict quickly escalates. It engulfs the entire region. NATO sees its presence there as purely defensive, aimed at deterring Russian aggression. Russia, however, views NATO's eastward expansion as a direct threat to its security. This perception fuels a dangerous cycle of mistrust and military buildup. Each side interprets the other's actions as inherently hostile, increasing the risk of miscalculation and unintended escalation. The Suwalki Gap, a narrow strip of land between Poland and Lithuania, separates Russia's Kaliningrad exclave from Belarus. Control of this corridor is crucial for both NATO and Russia. In a full-scale war between the US and Russia, both sides would employ a combination of conventional and asymmetric military strategies. Russia, with its vast land army, would likely prioritize seizing territory in Eastern Europe, particularly the Baltic states and Ukraine. Moscow would aim to quickly overrun NATO defenses, presenting the alliance with a fait accompli. Russia would leverage its integrated air defense systems and electronic warfare capabilities to counter NATO's air superiority. The United States, while possessing a smaller land force than Russia, would rely on its technological superiority, particularly in air power and precision-guided munitions. The US Air Force and Navy would launch massive air campaigns to degrade Russia's military capabilities and cripple its ability to sustain offensive operations. Cyber warfare would be a central element of the conflict, with both sides targeting each other's critical infrastructure, financial systems, and government networks. The cyber domain would become a crucial battleground, with potentially devastating consequences for both sides. The global economic impact of a US-Russia war would be catastrophic. The interconnectedness of the global economy means that a conflict between these two economic giants would send shockwaves across the world. Sanctions, trade disruptions, and financial market volatility would plunge the global economy into a deep recession. Russia and the US are major producers of essential commodities including oil, natural gas, and wheat. A war would disrupt these supplies, leading to skyrocketing prices and shortages. Global supply chains, already strained by the COVID-19 pandemic, would collapse. The resulting economic hardship would be felt most acutely by developing countries, potentially leading to widespread social unrest and political instability. Politically, the war would shatter the existing world order. The conflict would exacerbate existing geopolitical divisions, pushing the world into a new era of great power competition and uncertainty. The war would accelerate the trend towards a multipolar world, with no single power or bloc able to impose its will on others. In the aftermath of a US-Russia war, the world would likely be divided into two or more competing blocs. Each bloc would be centered around one of the major powers, such as the US, Russia, China, or the European Union. These blocs would compete for influence, resources, and technological dominance. International institutions, already weakened in recent years, would be further marginalized. The rules-based international order, already under strain, would be replaced by a more anarchic system, where might often makes right. The risk of nuclear proliferation would increase significantly. The war would also have profound consequences for international cooperation on global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and terrorism. Looming over any hypothetical war between the US and Russia is the specter of nuclear escalation. Both countries possess thousands of nuclear warheads, capable of unimaginable destruction. While both sides would likely seek to avoid a nuclear exchange, the fog of war, miscalculation, or desperation could lead to an uncontrollable escalation. The use of even a single nuclear weapon would have catastrophic consequences, not only for the belligerents, but for the entire planet. The immediate blast, firestorm, and radiation would kill millions. The long-term effects of nuclear winter would disrupt agriculture, leading to widespread famine and ecological collapse. The very existence of nuclear weapons poses an existential threat to humanity. The best way to prevent a catastrophic war between the US and Russia is to avoid the conditions that could lead to such a conflict. This requires sustained and meaningful dialogue between Washington and Moscow, aimed at rebuilding trust, managing differences, and establishing clear red lines. Both sides must recognize that they have a shared interest in avoiding a nuclear confrontation. Dialogue should focus on areas of common ground, such as arms control, non-proliferation, and counterterrorism. Confidence-building measures such as increased military transparency, incident prevention mechanisms, and regular high-level consultations can help to reduce the risk of miscalculation and unintended escalation. Alliances and alignments: the global chessboard. The hypothetical war between the US and Russia would inevitably draw in other major powers, reshaping alliances and alignments on a global scale. China, with its growing economic and military might, would be a key player in this new geopolitical landscape. While China has maintained a neutral stance on the conflict in Ukraine, it has deepened its strategic partnership with Russia in recent years. A war between the US and Russia would present China with both opportunities and risks. On the one hand, it could exploit the conflict to advance its own interests, such as expanding its influence in Central Asia or challenging US dominance in the Indo-Pacific. On the other hand, China would also face significant economic and security challenges. A global conflict would disrupt trade, investment, and supply chains, harming China's export-oriented economy. The price of peace: concessions and compromises. Achieving a lasting peace between the US and Russia will require both sides to make difficult concessions and compromises. Both sides must be willing to address each other's legitimate security concerns and refrain from actions that could be perceived as threatening. For the US, this might involve reconsidering its policy of NATO expansion and engaging in arms control negotiations that address Russia's concerns. Russia must be willing to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbors and withdraw its forces from occupied territories. Rebuilding from the ashes towards a post-war order. Even if a full-scale war between the US and Russia can be averted, the current crisis highlights the urgent need for a new framework for international security. The existing system, based on the post-Cold War order, is no longer tenable. A new framework must be based on the principles of mutual respect, dialogue, and cooperation. It must recognize the legitimate security interests of all states, regardless of their size, power, or ideology. It must also provide mechanisms for peaceful conflict resolution and promote multilateralism. Creating such a framework will require a fundamental shift in mindset. Towards a less certain future. The hypothetical war scenario explored in this essay paints a bleak picture of the future. While war is not inevitable, the current trajectory of US-Russia relations is deeply troubling. The risk of miscalculation, unintended escalation, and catastrophic conflict is higher than it has been in decades. The world stands at a crossroads. We can continue down the dangerous path of confrontation or choose the path of dialogue, diplomacy, and cooperation. The future of humanity may depend on the choices we make today.